Advocacy Director of the National Network for Arab American Communities. And here in D.C., one of Sean Hannity's guests from that very first clip I played, Brigitte Gabriel, the founder of Act for America. Let me ask you about a statistic that you brought up at this conference I mentioned in D.C. earlier this week. You said the radicals are estimated to be between 15 and 25%, according to all intelligence services around the world. That leaves 75% of them peaceful people. Where does that statistic come from?
That statistic comes from the combined intelligence of the Australians, the Canadians, the Jordanians, the Israelis, the United States, countries that share intelligence who are now monitoring what's happening in the world today.
You're saying 180 million to 300 million Muslims are radicals?
But you're talking about that fraction out of 1.2 billion people. Now, the majority of 1.2 billion people are peaceful people. They are not strapping bombs on their bodies. They are not going out blowing up people. They don't want to kill people.
Nor are the 15 to 25%.
15 to 25% are radicalized. Now, not every single one of them wants to blow himself up, but they either support terrorists who want to blow themselves up, provide them with financing, provide them for money, provide them with logistical support. 15 to 25% have been radicalized.
Brian, Miss Gabriel speaks out of two sides of her mouth. I mean, first of all, in one breath she'll say the West must support moderate Muslims and the moderate Muslims must speak up against terrorism. And in the same breath she'll say peaceful Muslims are irrelevant. Miss Gabriel needs to make up her mind when it comes to what is radical Islam. When asked by Australian News, she said a radical Muslim is someone who prays 5 times a day, someone who believes in the word of the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, someone who believes the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, is a perfect man. That's basically every Muslim. So I have no idea what she means. And where is the room for moderate Islam?
We need to support moderate Muslims, and we work with them. We actually have keynote speakers at our national conference who are moderate Muslims. I had a TV show where we invited them on to be on our TV show. We want to expose their message, but that's completely different than dealing with terrorism, what I deal with as a terrorism analyst. And that's what we need to discuss. The moderate Muslims, they can organize. Where are their collective voices? Where are the voices of the moderate Muslims speaking when girls kidnapped by Boko Haram disappear and we still do not know where they are?
We hear that quite a bit on Fox News. Where are the moderate Muslims? What's the answer to that question?
There are people out there that stood up on Boko Haram, on terrorism, on 9/11. There are national Muslim organizations who continue day in and day out to put out statements. Is the media covering it? I don't have control over the media to cover these stories. And I don't have to prove to anyone that I am an American born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and that my parents chose to come to the United States from living under military occupation in Palestine. And you talk about going into a grocery store in Arlington, Virginia, because you speak Arabic and you understand the culture and that's where you get your credibility from. I understand the culture and I speak the language too. And I've never, ever walked into a grocery store or into a hookah lounge or into a community center or a mosque in this country where people were saying that they wanted to destroy America.
We know what is being put out. There has been a study after study of the material that have been found in different mosques across the country, research after research, and these are factual research that have been presented to our government.
Do you do terrorism? Are you a terrorism analyst on terrorism in general? What about the Las Vegas shooting, the manifestos, the Oak Creek shooting where white supremacists walked into a Gurdwara and killed 6 people?
Terrorists are terrorists. Terrorists are terrorists. Well, I immigrated to the United States and I continued having the Middle East as my focus. And that's what I talk about. We are dealing, Linda, with a radical Islamic element that wants to wreak havoc on the United States. There are cars driving in New York right now testing for biological or chemical agents in the air to make sure that nothing has been detonated 24 hours a day. In New York City, in Chicago, in major cities in the United States, trying to protect the country.
But will we not look back?
That is something we need to discuss and deal with.
Will we not look back at this era as a gross overreaction to a terrorist threat that is not there in the way you're describing it to be?
The terrorist threat has been there, Brian, for years. America has been attacked under different administrations since 1979 by radical Islamists, whether we had a Democrat or a Republican.
And by people who have twisted Christianity into their own beliefs as well.
I agree with you. I agree with you. There are extremists on both sides. But when you look at radical Islam, the country is safe all these years since September 11th because our great protectors and first responders and FBI have put programs in place to protect us. And they are watching over the country. That's why we are safe.
Linda, do you feel there are specific examples of times where the media has fanned the flames of misunderstanding about Islam?
Absolutely. I mean, let's look at the Boston bombing. The first front page story came out on the New York Post of two young Algerian boys with book bags, calling them the bagmen. Immediately when an incident happens in this country that includes someone who just happens to be of an Arab country of origin or Muslim, we immediately start talking about terrorism and domestic terrorism. And when we have the same cases, similar cases, shootings almost every week in this country where dozens of people are being killed at the hands of guns and lax gun control, I'm more worried about getting shot by a gun or by a shooter in the U.S. than I am from a terrorist attack. The media oftentimes, including Fox News in particular, who actually does hit series on people like me for standing up and speaking my mind and practicing my American patriotism, the media does play a role in this, but it also gives, again, the platform to people who are pseudo-experts. And just because you grew up in the Middle East and just because you supposedly lived under a war doesn't make you a terrorism analyst. There are people who have extensive training in this area and at the same time can talk about very fringe Islamic terrorism without talking about Islam as a religion being a threat. The fastest growing religion in the country. And what Ms. Gabriel and her friends don't say is that many of the foiled plots that in this country have been foiled by information that came directly from the community, in some cases even the immediate family members of those who were alleged to be organizing a terrorist attack or traveling to places like Pakistan and others.
We're talking about, as two Americans, about how we can protect our country. We are both faced with an enemy wishing both our destruction. When those people attacked the World Trade Center, they wanted to kill Americans, Muslims, Christians, and everybody. When Zazi or Shahzad wanted to blow up Times Square or the New York subway system, they were planning on killing Americans, teenagers, people taking the subways back to work or back home. They wanted to kill all of us. When you're talking about plots of mass scale, somebody parking a car about to explode in Times Square, or want to blow up the subway system in New York, or want to blow up the Sears Tower in Chicago, we're talking about the mass killing of thousands of Americans, if not millions. That is what we need to be discussing and how we can protect the country.
Isn't that fear-mongering? To use the words like thousands and millions, isn't that fear-mongering?
The idea here is that you want to talk about terrorism, let's talk about terrorism and let's be prepared. But let's not prepare the American people that all terrorism that happens around the world comes from the Muslim community. That's the point that I want to debate with you here.
Well,
is that the idea here that terrorism is a serious issue, but terrorism does not equal Islam. It does not equal Muslims. I am from New York. I live in New York. I was here in New York on 9/11, Ms. Gabriel. I understand the impact that 9/11 had on communities in New York City. I could have been in the World Trade Center. I could be dead here today. There were Muslim responders. There were Muslims. 75 Muslims died in 9/11, including a first responder, Salman Hamdani. So I want you to understand that if you want to combat terrorism, you need to work within the Muslim community. You need to make sure that we are part of that discussion. And the, quote, moderate Muslims that you're talking about, which are almost every Muslim living here in this country, need to be part of this discussion. But to alienate the Muslim community, create them as the other, and to start making over-exaggerations about these potential attacks that haven't happened is not the way that you combat terrorism in any country, and especially not here in the United States, in a country where I can live here and speak freely, you can stand there and speak freely, and that's the kind of country that I want to live in, and I want to be part of the discourse.
And we want to make sure we protect this country, and we do work with a lot of moderate Muslims, like I said, who even come and speak at our national conference. What we're talking about now, Islamic terrorism. When you're watching the news this morning and you're hearing about terrorists in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, at Boko Haram, in Sudan, in Nigeria, in Chad, in Libya, I can go down the list. Every single instant when you're watching the news, it's not Buddhist terrorists, it's not Christian terrorists. Yes, there are some crazy people who commit terrorism, but right now the terrorism on mass scales, the bodies piled up, the people being beheaded, even Muslims shooting other Muslims, like what we watched in Iraq because they did not believe them that they were Sunnis. That is barbarism on a mass scale, and that's unacceptable in civilized society.
As long as you clarify and you stand up and say that the fringe extremists of any faith are only a tiny minority in the larger faith, this is what we want you to talk about. When you talk about Islam and you talk about the Quran, 1.4 billion people across the world follow the word of the Quran. You just got to make sure that you're being specific when you talk about terrorism of any faith, but more specifically Islamic terrorism.
They're not waiting to hear your opinion or my opinion. They want to kill us both. And this is why we must discuss how we can defeat the radicals who want to kill us, who are using the Quran as their source and justification for their murder.
Why are we having this discussion if you and I are irrelevant? Why the discourse? Why the debates? Why the analysis?
Exactly.
If we are irrelevant.
Because right now what we need to be talking about is how we can defeat the radicals.
Outside CNN studios, the average high temperature in December is normally 43. Warm weather's flooded the lower 48 states with 482 daily high temperature records across the country on Monday alone. Quite extraordinary, but is it evidence of man-made global warming? That's tonight's Battleground America. Joining me now are Bill Nye, the science guy, and Mark Morano. He's the publisher of ClimateDepot.com. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Mark Morano. If I may, you are implacably opposed to the concept of man-made climate change. Why?
We followed the evidence. There are quite literally hundreds of factors that influence global temperature, everything from tilt to the Earth's axis to ocean cycles to water vapor, methane, solar system, the sun, cloud feedback, volcanic dust. The idea that CO2 is the tail that wags the dogs is not supportable. And if you go down and look at the scientific literature, we're finding reams of data in new peer-reviewed studies showing the medieval and Roman warming periods as warm or warmer than today without our CO2 emissions. So what's happened here is the whole movement, because now we've gone 16 years without global warming, according to the UN data, and they've now morphed into extreme weather. And we have the absurd spectacle of people claiming that acts of Congress and the United Nations can control the weather and make hurricanes less nasty and make tornadoes less frequent, which, by the way, none of them are showing any trends at all that are unusual.
Okay, Bill Nye. Your response?
Well, we start talking about the facts. Those medieval warming period and the Roman warming period, those are just in Europe, and they're not representative.
Both
so let's see if we can agree on a couple things. Do you agree that when I was a kid or when you were a kid, there was 340 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Sure, carbon dioxide's rising. What's your point?
Okay.
No.
So here's the point: is it's rising extraordinarily fast. That's the difference between the bad old days and now. It's much faster than ever in history, and so this is
let him finish.
Well,
please. Let him finish.
It's the rate that's of great concern more than the actual.
And what do you put that rate down to, Bill?
Oh, it's human activity. I mean, you go back. This is what I say all the time. So you look in the ice, and you find bubbles of trapped gas from 200 years ago, or let alone 1,000 years ago. There's nobody running around with a hypodermic needle injecting bubbles of gas in ancient ice cores. I mean, that's the ancient atmosphere in there. And so you can determine the composition of the ancient atmosphere exactly. This medieval warming period is brought up quite often, but it was really a European phenomenon, and it wasn't global.
And what are the biggest factors, the man-made factors, creating the acceleration of CO2 in the atmosphere?
The biggest thing is when I was 9 years old, the Earth's population changed from 2.999 billion to 3 billion. Now in my lifetime, it's now 7 billion people trying to live the way we live in the developed world. And we're just burning carbon and spewing carbon dioxide.